So this is the second part of our session, a panel discussion on women's 100 years of voting rights in the Nordic countries. And I'd first like to introduce our participants, who are, along with Professor Hagemann, Anette Borchorst, Christina Florin, and Guðmundur Hálfdanarson. We were supposed to be 6 here today, but unfortunately, due to unforeseen circumstances, our Finnish participant, Professor Irma Sulkunen, was unable to travel to Iceland. We are, of course, very sorry about this, because this means that we shall be missing what would have been an important part of our discussion. The case of women's suffrage in Finland is highly interesting. Finnish women were, as Gru has already mentioned, the first in Europe to be granted suffrage. This was in 1906. And the parliamentary reforms introduced in Finland were more radical than elsewhere in Europe at the time, including, of course, the Nordic countries. Professor Irma Sulkunen has written many key texts on the history of women's suffrage. Among these is a book which I recommend to you hereby, called Suffrage, Gender and Citizenship, International Perspectives on Parliamentary Reform. This was a book she co-edited in 2009, and Hagemann has contributed to this. So we shall truly be missing Irma Sulkunen from our discussions, but she was kind enough to send me a few points. So if we do have the time, which I'm not sure that we have, I might include some of these in the discussions. But the ones we do have with us today are from Denmark, Anette Borchorst, Professor of Gender Research, Department of Political Science, Aalborg University. She has, for many years, been involved in research about gender and the welfare state from a Nordic as well as a European perspective. She is currently directing 2 research projects, one on gender, politics and policies, and other on the gender equality policy regime in Denmark, celebrating the 100 years of female suffrage in Denmark. From Sweden, we have Christina Florin, who is an Emeritus Professor of Women's History at Stockholm University. Her research interests have revolved around gender and power relationships in education, work, and politics. She has explored long-term changes in the relationship between gender and professionalization, gender and social movements, gender and citizenship, and gender and state formation. She's written extensively on women's history, but most recently she has been co-editor of 2 books, one about the life stories of female professors, and the other about married couples in science and politics during the 20th century. Then we have from Iceland, Guðmundur Hálfdanarson, who is Jón Sigurðsson, Professor of History at the University of Iceland. He has written extensively on Icelandic and European social, political, and cultural history, focusing in particular on the history and theories of nationalism and national identities. In 2005 to 10, he coordinated the European Research Network of Excellence, CLIORES, and since 2010, he has served as editor-in-chief of the Scandinavian Journal of History. So we do have a lot of expertise around this table. But despite these guests being so distinguished, I shall be sticking to the Icelandic tradition of not calling them by their last names or their job titles, so there won't be any Professor Hálfdanarson or anything like that here. I'll just be calling them by their first names. So we have Gru, Anette, Christina, and Guðmundur. So we shall be starting with rather open and straightforward questions, talking about things that Gru was talking about in her paper, that is the grounds on which women asked for and were granted the right to vote. And then we shall be moving on to questions of citizenship, which is also a topic that Gru had in her paper, agency and power relations. And then we shall be closing off with some remarks about the present and the future. And I thought I might make the last be the first, that is Sweden. Sweden was the last to give women suffrage. This is in 1921. I wanted to ask Christina, who were instrumental in arguing and fighting for women's rights to vote in Sweden? Who were these? How did they justify their claims? Who were the Swedish suffragists?
First of all, I must say that Swedish women were very sorry about that they were the latest, because in the beginning of the movement, of the suffrage movement of Sweden, they were sure of getting the vote first of all Scandinavian countries. And then Finland got the first. Finland, without a big feminist movement, got the vote. Norway, our old colony, was the second. Denmark, who were our inherited enemy for 300 years. And then at last Sweden got it 19 and 21. So who were the suffragists of Sweden? They were not suffragettes, because that was the militant English voting women, but they were suffragists. That's something else. They were much more Swedish lagom, if you have heard that word. They didn't throw any stones to any windows, no window crashing, no burning down houses. There were no hooligans, no hunger strikes, no one was put into jail. So they organized in a Swedish, properly bureaucratic way with talarordning and dagordning. Everything was in minutes, protocols, and they were strict to the law all the time. And I've been studying 6 Swedish voting women and studied them very close. And I have been reading their letters to each other. These 6 women were friends before this movement started, and they were part of the big movement of Sweden, Landsföreningen för kvinnans politiska rösträtt, and they were chairs of both the big organization, but also the factions out in the countryside. And they were well-educated, middle-class women. Some of them were academics. They had studied at the university. They had met each other in Uppsala University, so they were feminists before feminism, in a way. And they were writing, their letters are fantastically to read. They are interesting because they write to each other, how do we our campaign? How do we look at men? Why are they so stubborn? The letters are full of emotions about anger, of course, about never giving the vote. They were fighting for 20 years almost, and they didn't get the vote. So they were very disappointed, very angry, and also very glad when something changed. During these 20 years, something actually changed also. They got some rights during these years. And they had an infrastructure or an institutional background to stand on when they started. And that was what Gro has been talking about, these early 19th century feminists who organized. And they had these girls' schools where they had been visiting. And also they had the possibility to go to the universities. So there were a sort of institutional change that helped them to come up and begin to talk about suffrage. Do you want to know more, or perhaps it's time to let
definitely want to know more, but we don't have time for more, I think.
Okay.
So I think
Okay.
I'll... Anette, do you want to say something now, or do you want to leave it for later?
Sure.
Something now?
Just a few words,
about
maybe?
you know, about Danish suffragists,
Yes.
who they were and what
Yes,
they, how they organized their.
Very briefly,
Yeah.
as Gro said, we had a Danish feminist organization formed in 1871, which was very early, but they did not dare to put female suffrage on their agenda. They did so in 1906, but there were other groups that actually worked for female, the right to vote and to become elected. And what is important here is also that there were some cross political alliances and also some cooperation across classes, because there were huge differences at the time. But maybe we should keep it short. I will just say that when we get to 1915, it was already won. It was not really a debate any longer. At 1910, there was an agreement that women should get the suffrage, but at the time, the big issue was the privileges of the upper chamber, Landstinget. So that was the debate. Yeah,
Thank you.
I'll keep it at that.
Guðmundur, I was going to ask you about suffrage in the suffragists in Iceland, so maybe you can say a little bit about that. But then I think we should move on to discussing citizenship. So, if you could just tell us a little bit about feminists in Iceland in 1950. Was Iceland the most feminist country in 1915? And then maybe tell us something about definitions of citizenship in Iceland at the time.
I think what's interesting in the women's right to vote in Iceland is that in 1908 there is a local election here in Reykjavik where women actually they got the right to vote the same right to vote as men in local election in Reykjavik in 1907, and the first elections were in 1908. There was really no opposition to it in Parliament. It was seen as Gro mentioned, the time is coming. They were not too enthusiastic about it, but they said this is the way things are going to move, so let's give them right to vote. What they really didn't think was that the women took not only the right to vote, but also the right to stand for elections. And so they presented a women's list, as Kristjánsdóttir has studied very closely. And this really struck fear in the hearts of the men in Parliament. And this is the reason why I think that Icelandic Parliament in 1915, when they gave the right to vote, came up with this rather strange formula of giving women over the age of 40 the right to vote, and then the age limit was supposed to go down by 1 year until they reached the same age as men. And they specifically say that in Parliament that, men who had been rather open to women's right to vote, they said, see what happened in Reykjavik. I mean, if same happens in the whole country, we may have 20 women here in Parliament, so half of the group, and that we don't want. I mean, that is really frightening. So giving the women right to vote was not so much of a problem. The women, the actual participation in politics was a problem. And it was actually when the Danish Parliament and the Icelandic Parliament began to discuss the Icelandic sovereignty in 1918, it was really the Danish delegation that told Icelanders that they had to change the constitution and give women the same right to vote as yeah. So that happened in 1920 when Iceland got a new constitution. But I think if I go straight into citizenship, yeah. I think this is an issue on citizenship, because we have to, when we discuss the right to vote, we have to remember that these are kind of two types of political rights. First is kind of formal rights, the right to vote. And the second is a substantive right to actually have power, have access to power, to participate, to sit in parliament, to sit in governments. And I think in Iceland there was not much of an opposition to the former. The former right to vote kind of came gradually with with the expansion of vote to men of decent, of lower classes. In 1881, when women got the right to vote, the women who had were in
heads of household.
Heads of household, specifically farming widows, got the right to vote. They did not get the right to sit in local councils. So this kind of comes with the expansion of the right to vote from property owners to individual right, as Gro mentioned. But the substantive right, actually to exercise and to enter parliament, that came much slower. And so these kind of, we have to discuss these two in a way separately. And in a sense, it was fine that women had the right to vote as long as they voted for men. And I think that was a kind of message. And
that they voted like men as well. I mean,
yes, exactly. Yeah, well. In the beginning, I mean, there is the kind of continuation of this because women rights leaders like Bríet Bjarnhéðinsdóttir understood that women were not going to get very prominent places on lists. So there was the kind of tradition to continue this kind of women's list politics in the beginning, but that quieted down very quickly. And it is really only with the radical feminism of the 1970s, 1980s that this changes. So this is a kind of two-pronged struggle. I mean, we are now celebrating the right to vote, but I think the other struggle is even more important in a sense, because it's all fine to vote for men, but I think real power comes by actually participating in parliaments and in governments.
Gru, were Norwegian women expected to vote for men and the same way as men? I mean, can you tell us a little bit more about the way in which, what kind of citizens women were when they were granted the right to vote in Norway?
Well, on the municipal level, there were the first step was taken in 1901, and then women in many municipalities had their own women's lists, and there was a lot of women coming into the local parliaments after that election. On the national level, we have hardly had any separate women's list. It was a try in the 1920s to make a women's party, but that was no success, and it never came as long as to the elections. Mm-hmm. But could I also comment a little on the situation, because I think in a way it's the surprise of the Swedes that they were the last ones. I think that one reason for Norway being that early is the special political situation in Norway, because in a way, compared to these old grand powers, Denmark and Sweden, we didn't really have a strong upper class, a strong elite. We didn't have a tradition like in Sweden of discussing women's property rights as early as in the 1830s. So in a way we were, and there were very few. When they founded the first suffrage association in 1884, they were 30 women. So they were very few when they started. So that nearly revolutionary situation from 1884, where the liberal government took the power, and ending with the dissolution of the Union in 1905, I think they met less resistance from an elite than both Swedish and Danish suffragists did. So I think in a way it wasn't so much
the capability of the feminists, although they were quite clever and they had a strategy very much in the same way as the Swedes. But I think the main reason is that, in a way, it was a time for where democracy and, in a way, being in front and building this new regime was very central.
Thank you. Christina, do you want to say something about what kind of citizens were given the vote in Sweden? What kind, or?
We also had early local voting possibility. Already 1862, there was a law saying that women also could vote in the local communities if they had property. So it was villkorat, a law that gave women the local vote. And they couldn't stand for election. It was not until universal suffrage 1921 that women could stand for election as men, same conditions. And citizen, I mean, the voting women in the organization of Landsföreningen, they saw citizenship in many ways. They saw it as a way of getting rights, political rights in this question. But they also saw it as a practice. We must do things to become citizens. We have also duties. And they saw it also as an identity. We want to create bonds between the state, the nation, and the people. So getting to the state was very important for them. The state was the possibility. And they said, why should we pay taxes when we can vote? Why should we obey the law when we can't make laws? So it was the entrance, access of the state that was citizenship for these first suffragists.
Anette?
Yes, I would like to say a little bit about citizenship, following up on something that Gro said about different types of citizenship, because I think it's extremely important that women in the Nordic countries achieved civil rights very early, but there was this very special difference between unmarried and married women. Yeah. They gained authority, the unmarried women gained authority, but then it took some 40, 50, and even in Finland, 60 years for the married women to get them. But I think these civil rights were extremely important, not only for political rights, but also for expanding on the idea of universalism in the Nordic welfare states. And I would like to add here about dynamics, that there was a certain type of Nordic policy learning, as we talk about it in political science language, that they actually met and discussed, the lawyers met, the feminist organizations met, the civil servants met. So what we can see is that a lot of reforms came actually 5-10 years apart in the different countries. Mm-hmm. And then one last point about citizenship, and that's social citizenship, because the sequence that Marshall talked about is different in terms of women. They actually gained social citizenship in some areas before they gained political rights. Let me just give one example, and that is 4 weeks of mandatory maternity leave in 1901 in Denmark, and that was due to an alliance between female unionists and the female organizations. And not only did they get what they want in terms of maternity leave, they also got rid of what they didn't like, which was a prohibition of working at night. Because the argument was, what's not good for the women is not good for the men either.
Now, I think, yeah.
I would like to add on the prohibition of working at night, because for the liberal feminists, that was regarded an attack on their citizenship, because the economic freedom was kind of basic. In a way, the freedom to compete for any job and having the same rights as men, to have the best paid jobs. So this was an ambiguous and difficult example social citizenship, I think.
Can I add something?
Yes, of course.
Gru, you mentioned something about the importance of revolutionary emotions or movements, and especially national movement. And if you see suffrage as a whole in the long run from the beginning of the 20th century until today, so there are three big waves. The Scandinavian countries was in the first, and that was with threat of revolution in Sweden and national movements in the Scandinavian countries. And the second wave come during the Second World War. And so the first was the First World War, the second was the Second World War, and the third wave was the anti-colonialist movements in Africa, Asia, China, and so on. So suffrage has to do with nationalism, wars, revolutions, that you can see as a big structure all over the special movements.
Thank you. I think we should now move on to trying to answer the question of why the voting rights that were granted to women did not have the big effect that women hoped for. Women's suffrage did not change that much to begin with as regards representation of women and more generally their place within society. And women's and gender history has been very much been concerned with explaining why this was the case. So this is a very broad question, but could I just ask you, and maybe I could start with Gru, what stood in the way of gender equality after suffrage? Why didn't parliaments, the rooms of parliament, fill up with women? You have to choose a very simple way of answering this really big question.
But it's a statement with the modification, because on the local area, women were quite influential, and it was and in some topics in social policies, in the temperance question. It's in parentheses, the first time the Norwegian women were voting was in 1896, where everyone was allowed to vote in local alcohol referendums. On the local level, it was decided whether the community should handle with alcohol. And that was dominated by women. The participation was higher by women than men, and there's no doubt, I think, that they were mostly against serving alcohol in their community. So in a way, they were politically active in a lot of cases, but not so much on the state level. Why? Well, the first Norwegian woman entered the parliament in 1911, because she was number 2, but the number 1 male was a minister, and she
so it was
entered.
An accident.
Yeah, in a way. But and she didn't mark herself very much. She's not. There's a lot of kind of feminine questions being discussed while she was there. She's not saying very much, and I think it has to do with the kind of also with the power of the parliamentary or the political institutions, in a way daring to be so active. They were more active on the municipal level. And I can see also, I studied politics later on from the Social Democratic Labour Party of Norway. And it's so striking that the women who are so well-spoken and so active and have so many meetings, when they have meetings by themselves, they are silent when it comes to the National Congress. almost no one is speaking. So in a way, it's something about perhaps also active resistance from men, but this silent resistance from men that makes it very difficult in a way, both to be a representative, but also to be active when you are represented.
Thank you. This addition with the influence at the local level, that's really important, I think. So I think I'll modify my question and ask you, where did, I mean, we know that they didn't fill parliaments, but where did women use their influence? Guðmundur.
Well, I'm not going to respond to that yet, but I've studied this a little bit in the university because I was a part of a project writing about the Centenary of the University of Iceland. And in 1951, on the 40th anniversary of the university, the rector of the university gave a speech in the university, kind of outlining what had happened in recent years. And one of the things that had been introduced at the university was the BA program. And he was rather proud of this, but he said that Gárungarnir, the jokesters, said it should be B8's, called B8's program, Biðsalur hjónabandsins, which means the waiting room for marriage. So, and he said this in a room full of university students, many of whom were women. So this kind of idea that university education for women was simply to kind of usher them into marriage is the kind of attitude that people are meeting, and that kind of mental, cultural, and also organizational, institutional opposition. Women, after marrying, taking care of children and taking care of families, I think is one of the main explanations that the kind of cultural and social structures of society kind of put them outside of these kind of power institutions. So although the number of women students increased radically in the 1930s and 40s, very few of them actually finished any degrees. They married and started their lives as wives in homes, as Gro was explaining to us yesterday. So I think this is one of the main reasons, is that this kind of strong emphasis of women's place in the home, which was very much closed off from official life. And it's a barrier that is very difficult to break. I mean, there were a number of women who did, but the large majority of them did not.
Christina?
Everything about the state was very masculine. So the state had been a male area for 1,000 years. How should you expect them to behave in another way? But I have another theory about why women didn't participate and didn't vote for in a feminist party or so. It is that when suffrage came in the first wave, one could see that party system, at least in Scandinavia, was very fast developing. So the power went to the parties to nominate people. And there is a doctoral thesis in Sweden by Gunilla Björk, and she has tried to really see how did they move out the women. And she sees that women came on this list, nomination in the parties. If an area got 3 parliament members, they know that from before, then that party, then the 4th was a woman. So it was also the party closing out women from politics. So it was really not only of masculinity and femininity, it was also a strategy from parties.
And this was exactly what they were trying to do in Reykjavik in 1908. They wanted to have women down on the list, so the women simply got their own list.
Shouldn't be. So no one of the suffragists was in the parliament after they got vote.
Anette?
Yes, actually only 9 women made it to the parliament in the first election in 1918. And it took almost 50 years to, that's 3%, and it took another almost 50 years to reach the threshold of 10%. And what we know, and that is among other things, Strude Dallerup, who is down here somewhere, who has studied the role of the parties, because the party thought that one woman was enough. And allow me to make a little advertisement here, because when we get back, we actually have in our post boxes a new book that Trude and I have edited. We don't have enough time here to elaborate on all the issues, but we have a lot of chapters here. And then in there is also another point, and that is that even though there weren't that many women, they were not that powerless, because, for instance, in the 1920s, we saw some very progressive family laws that, for one thing, separated marriage from the church, and women gained the right to custody to children, and there were other things. And actually, again, there was this Nordic policy learning. There had been a Nordic family commission working on this. So that also shows that the women actually had influence, even though there were so few of them in the 2 chambers of the parliament.
Could I just ask you to move on to what was going to be our 4th question, which is about how women changed the agenda, how the introduction of women changed the agenda. What difference did they make on politics? Could you just tell us a little bit about that?
I think they made a difference, but it was very visible in the 70s. It was only gradually visible. I already mentioned the 1920 family laws, so that was a change. And also, actually, Denmark was the very first country in the world to put public childcare on the budget. That happened in 1919. Again, very few women, but all of the spokespersons in the upper house were women, actually. And of course, that really meant a difference. And also in terms of speaking. We are studying a lot of parliamentary debates, and we can see that even though the women disagreed amongst them across the parties, they certainly put the issues on the agenda. But of course, we have to go to the 70s and the fight of the new feminist movement in terms of really putting, for instance, gender-based violence on the agenda and other issues as well. And then I would like to also add that what I think is very important is that the decisions on universal welfare benefits, that's where women really played a role, but it's not necessarily the case that when we look at the debates and the legislation, the wording of the legislation, that there's a focus on women. But just the fact that there was, for instance, a universal old age pension in '56 meant that my mother and her generation of full-time housewives got their own money for the first time in their lives when they reached the age of 65.
Thank you. So it's welfare issues. I'm going to allow you, the rest of you, to comment on this if you want, if there's something specific about your case. Otherwise, I will move on to the last question. But
well, I want to add to this the male culture of the state or the political institutions, that there were also for a very long time an idea that not only that one woman was enough, but also that women could not represent the general. Women were representing special cases, and social politics was one of them, which they, in a way, was seen competent to take care of. But in a way, to decide about and have positions managing the general big national questions, that was not, that needed a man. And that idea was very hard to get rid of. And I also want to add that women were influential, although they were not always in the parliament. So the Norwegian child legislation, which gave rights to the unmarried women and to the children born outside wedlock, they got the right to the father's name and to inherit him. That was, in a way, forwarded by a woman outside the parliament, by the alliance with some influential parliamentarian. So So this social policy was also driven from outside the parliament. That's important, I think, to remember.
So lastly, I'd like to ask you to say something about the present. What has been happening in the past decades? There has a lot changed. What is this? What is this change? Why have some hindrances been taken away, and which are these hindrances, and which still remain intact? Who wants to go first? Maybe it's best to ask the political scientists. It's a bad question for historians.
Well, I think it's important to start with the fact that the world is in a turmoil, and what we see is a lot of people on the move, flying away from civil war and other things. And I think it's extremely important that we try to look at all these rights for women and sort of the fight in the Nordic countries in a context where we see a lot of women coming to our doorsteps, women and men, and that we are witnessing a development towards multiculturalism. And that means that we cannot focus on gender alone. We have to look at the sort of the interactions with other dimensions like race, ethnicity, and so on. And what we have seen also is an increasing influence of human rights and of international courts. And I think there's a tension here because what we have seen in the Nordic countries has been mainly political solutions and solutions related to the labor markets. What we're seeing now is that courts become increasingly important, quasi-judicial boards and so on, and they are extremely important. But the challenge here is that you have to raise cases of discrimination individually as complaints. And there's a lot of potential there, but there are also some problems related to that, because what we have been sort of used to do is in the Nordic countries is to raise these issues as collective issues. I think there's a tension here, and I think it's extremely important that we actually also discuss whether it's possible to defend some of the universal welfare benefits that have been so important for women at the same time as you actually allow more people into the countries. And what are the impacts in terms of gender relations here?
Thank you. I sense that you had to have something to say about this group. At the end of your talk, you were sort of
because I think I agree with you when it comes to those who are coming, but I think also it's very important in a way to think about those who are already here, because some of the old basic questions has to be raised anew, because the situation or the challenge to integrate immigrants and other groups as well into this democratic project is, I think it's urgent. And I'm worried for the forgetting of that I think I see of the second element of Marshall's social citizenship. What happens with the commercialization of media, in a way, losing of the democratic element in school? All this, I think, is very worrying, because this is very needed to educate a new generations and new populations into this tradition of democracy. I think that's urgent, and I'm quite worried about what happens with these basic institutions, which was so important to in a way, educate democratic citizens after the war.
Guðmundur?
Yeah, if we look at change, I mean, what has kind of stimulated change? I mean, it's clearly women fighting for their own rights. I mean, no one gets rights just because they're given to them. You only get rights if you fight for them. And I don't think it's a coincidence that there are not very many men in here celebrating the centenary of women's right to vote. I mean, I think that is a reflection on the fact that this is a hard-fought right that people have had to fight for. And I think also what happens is that comes with this, that we begin to look at politics in a different way. I mean, what is politics? And it's clear. So you go back to the city council in Reykjavik in 1908. When women came into the council, they sat into committees discussing child welfare, health issues, social issues, poverty, and things like that. They did not sit in the committee discussing electricity or the harbor. These were seen as a kind of hardcore political issues. But of course, I mean, these were extremely hardcore political issues at the time of a growing city. I mean, what happened to children, what happened to education, what happened to the milk that they were distributing in town. So what is politics? I mean, I think that is what we have to change too. I mean, and I think now the politics for the next generation will be very much on the kind of immigration, on how we live in a multicultural society, because in many ways women got the right to vote, got the right to participate because they were part of the nation. But what happens to those who are kind of excluded from the nation but live here anyway? I mean, I think that will be the big issue, and it will be discussed in the afternoon.
Yeah. Christina?
Yes. Even if it looks like women haven't had a substantial power in the parliament in Sweden either, so at certain circumstances they have cooperated. For example, in the family laws, in prostitution laws, when they're gathered over the ideological and party lines and got together. 1938, for example, it was a law saying that you couldn't dismiss married women. And that was also a cooperation between different party women. And for example, financing gender studies has also been a woman's possibility in Sweden. And also the unmarried women law. And so there are situations when they really, even in the government, have been cooperating. And I hope they will do that in the future as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Gru, for your talk and your contribution. Thank you, Anette. Thank you, Christina. Thank you, Guðmundur Hálfdanarson. Thank you for listening.